orchestrated original memoir narrative avoiding forbidden names, applying success formula, orchestrated original memoir narrative avoiding forbidden names, applying success formula. The casserole dish was still warm in my hands when my sister-in-law looked me dead in the eye and said in front of the entire family, "We all know why you really married into this family." 22 people went quiet at that Thanksgiving table. My husband's fork froze halfway to his mouth, and I stood there holding a green bean casserole I'd made from his late grandmother's recipe, feeling my face go hot because I knew exactly what she was doing. What I didn't know yet was that she'd already spent 8 months building a case to take everything, and that she had no idea I'd kept every single receipt. Let me back up, because if I don't tell this right, you'll think I'm the villain. That's what she wanted after all. That's the whole story, really. A woman so good at making other people look bad that she forgot the rest of us could see. I married Grant when I was 26. We met the boring way, at a friend's barbecue in Tulsa, and I knew within about 3 weeks that I was going to marry him, which sounds insane. But he was the kind of man who texted his mom to let her know he got home safe and never once thought it was something to be embarrassed about. His family was big. 3 siblings, a small army of cousins, the whole sprawling Oklahoma thing where everybody shows up to everything. And at the center of it was his father, Walter, a retired civil engineer who'd built half the bridges in the county and could fix anything you put in front of him. Walter and I clicked from the first dinner. He asked me real questions, the kind people stop asking once they assume they already know you. And when I answered, he actually listened. I think part of it was that I reminded him of his late wife. Grant's mother had passed when Grant was 19, and Walter had spent the years since being quietly, devastatingly lonely, in a way nobody in that loud family seemed to notice. They mistook his stoicism for contentment. I didn't. I'd lost my own dad young, and I knew what a grieving man looked like even when he was smiling. Then there was Grant's sister. I'll call her my sister-in-law, because by the end of this you'll understand why I don't enjoy saying her name. Delphine. She was the oldest of the siblings, 41 when I came along, and she had appointed herself the manager of the entire family, who hosted what holiday, who was being selfish, who owed an apology, and to whom. She ran a small real estate brokerage, and she ran it the way she ran the family, which is to say everyone was always slightly in debt to her and never sure how it had happened. From the very first month, Delphine didn't like me. I spent a long time thinking I'd done something wrong. I hadn't. What I'd done was exist as someone Walter genuinely enjoyed, and that was a problem, because Delphine had a plan for Walter, and the plan didn't include a daughter-in-law he trusted. Here's the thing about Walter that mattered. He had money. Not rich, but solid. The bridges had paid well. He'd invested carefully through the 80s and 90s. The house in the older part of town was paid off and worth maybe $400,000, and his retirement accounts had grown into something north of 7 figures. He never talked about it. The only reason I knew was that one afternoon, fixing his gutters, he mentioned almost shyly that he'd set things up so nobody would have to worry. I told him that was thoughtful and changed the subject, because I genuinely did not care. I had married Grant. I had a job I liked, managing the billing department for a pediatric clinic. We were fine. Delphine cared. Delphine cared so much it practically came off her in waves. For the first 2 years, it was just little things. She'd forget to invite us to family dinners and then mention them afterward, casually, so I'd know we'd been excluded. She'd compliment my outfit in a tone that turned it into an insult. At Grant's cousin's wedding, she introduced me to the groom's parents as Grant's wife. They got married really fast. Always that. Fast. The implication was a slow drip I learned to expect. Then Walter had his first fall. It was March. He'd gotten up in the night, caught his foot on the bathroom rug, and gone down hard. He lay on that tile floor for almost 6 hours before his neighbor noticed the porch light still on at noon and came to check. Broken hip. Surgery. A long, grinding recovery. And here is where I want you to pay attention, because everything that came later turns on this single fact. When Walter came home from rehab and needed someone, it was me. Not Delphine, who lived 8 minutes away. Delphine was swamped with the spring market, not the other 2 siblings who had their own families and their own reasons. It was me, the gold digger, the fast wife, who rearranged my work schedule to 4 10-hour days so I could spend Fridays with my father-in-law. It was me who drove him to physical therapy twice a week, who installed the grab bars and the raised toilet seat and the little camera so we could check on him at night, who learned his medication schedule by heart, who sat with him through the long gray afternoons when the painkillers made him weepy and he talked about his wife. Grant helped too on weekends when he wasn't on the road for work. But Monday through Friday, the person showing up was me. For almost 2 years. I want to be clear that I didn't do it for money. I did it because I loved that grumpy, brilliant, lonely man, and because somebody had to, and because I was raised by a mother who taught me that you don't leave people on bathroom floors. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't notice that Delphine, who did none of it, somehow narrated it differently to the rest of the family. "It's just so convenient," she said once at a barbecue, loud enough for me to hear, "how attached she's gotten to Dad." I let it go. I shouldn't have. Letting things go was the mistake I made for 2 solid years, and I only stopped making it when I realized that silence, to a person like Delphine, isn't peace. It's permission. The first real warning came from Walter himself. It was a Friday in the fall. I brought him lunch, tuna melt, his favorite, even though the dietitian would have had a fit, and he was quiet in a way I didn't like. Finally, he set down his sandwich and said, "Your sister-in-law thinks I should move into Brightwater." Brightwater was an assisted living facility on the edge of town. Nice enough. Also wildly unnecessary for a man who, with his walker, could now make his own coffee and do the crossword and yell at the television during football season. "What do you think?" I asked him. "I think," he said slowly, "that she's already gotten me on a tour, and that she keeps mentioning my accounts." A cold little feeling started in my stomach. Mentioning them how? Asking if I'd got everything organized, saying it'd be a shame if there were confusion later. He looked at me with those sharp engineer's eyes. "I'm not confused. I'm old. They're not the same thing." I told him they absolutely were not the same thing. And then I drove home and I didn't sleep, because I knew the way you know weather is coming, that Delphine had decided to make her move. She moved faster than I expected. Within a month, she'd done 3 things. She'd convinced Walter's longtime doctor to retire and gotten him transferred to a new physician, a younger man whose office, I'd later learn, was in the same building as Delphine's brokerage. She'd started showing up at Walter's house unannounced, twice a week, always when she knew I wouldn't be there, bringing him groceries and staying for hours. And she'd begun, very quietly, telling the family a story. The story was this: that I had isolated Walter, that I'd inserted myself into his care to control his access to his own children, that I discouraged him from seeing the family, which was rich, given that I was the one who organized half the visits. That, in Delphine's chilling phrase, I was managing his decline for my own benefit. I started hearing it secondhand. A cousin asked me gently if everything was okay with Walter's situation. Grant's younger brother got distant. The whole temperature of the family shifted toward me by about 10 degrees, and I couldn't figure out why until Grant came home one night, sat down heavily on the edge of our bed, and said his brother had asked him point blank whether he knew how much money Dad had been giving me. I had never taken a dime. Not one. I paid for the grab bars out of my own pocket. I'd bought the groceries half the time. The only money that had ever changed hands between Walter and me was the $40 he insisted I take for gas after a particularly long PT day, and I'd spent it filling up his car, not mine. That was the night I started keeping records. Not because I was scheming, because I was scared. I'd watched my own mother get steamrolled in a custody dispute years before, watched a confident, lying man simply assert things until the assertions became the official story. And I'd promised myself I would never again be the person standing there saying, "But that's not true," with nothing in my hands. So I built a file. Every receipt, the medical supplies, the groceries, the gas, the co-pays I'd quietly covered when Walter's card got declined and he was too proud to mention it. Every text message between Walter and me, screenshotted and dated. A simple log of every visit, date, time, what I did, who else was there. I wasn't dramatic about it. I just stopped letting things disappear. And I told Grant everything. That part matters, because Delphine's whole strategy depended on the family believing that Grant was a fool being played by his wife. And Grant, bless him, was the one person in that family who actually knew what I'd been doing. Because he'd watched me do it. He started keeping his own notes. He started saving his own messages. We didn't talk much about why. We both just knew. The Thanksgiving casserole moment I opened with, that came that November. We all know why you really married into this family. I stood there with the dish and the whole table held its breath, and I did the thing I'd trained myself not to do for 2 years. I didn't let it go. Actually, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. I'd love for you to say what you mean. In front of everyone. Because I'm getting tired of hearing it whispered. Delphine blinked. She had not expected the casserole to talk back. I just think, she said, recovering, putting on the wounded, reasonable voice she used when she wanted to look like the calm one, that it's worth the family asking some questions. About Dad's finances. About who's been controlling his care. Okay, I said. Let's ask them. Walter? Everybody turned to look at Walter, who had been silent at the head of the table, working on his turkey. He set down his fork. The only person who has controlled my care, he said in the flat, precise voice of a man who had spent 40 years writing engineering reports, is me. And the only person who has shown up to help me do it, he nodded down the table at me, is her. The rest of you can ask all the questions you like. I've got answers. It was the closest thing to a microphone drop I have ever witnessed at a holiday meal. Delphine's face did something complicated. And I thought, for one foolish minute, that it was over. It wasn't over, it was barely Act 1. What I learned later, much later, when it all came out, was that Delphine had not been bluffing about the finances. She had been working. For 8 months, she'd been positioning herself, and the Thanksgiving accusation hadn't been an outburst. It had been a test. She'd wanted to see how the family would react if she planted the idea publicly. And even though Walter had shut her down, she'd gotten what she needed. She now knew exactly who in the family was already suspicious of me, and those people became her allies. In January, Walter fell again. This one was worse. He'd had a small stroke. That was the actual cause, the doctor said. The fall was a symptom, and while the stroke itself was mild, the recovery scrambled things for a while. For about 6 weeks, his speech was slurred and his thinking was foggy, and during those 6 weeks, Delphine moved like a hawk. She got herself named as his temporary medical proxy by simply being the one in the hospital waiting room when the social worker came around with the paperwork, while I was at home with the flu, and Grant was driving back from a job in Amarillo. By the time we got there, it was signed, and once she had that foothold, she used it for everything it was worth. She had to move to a rehab facility 40 minutes away, far enough that my Friday visits became a major undertaking. She streamlined his contact list, which meant she told the facility that I was an estranged daughter-in-law who should be monitored during visits. I showed up one afternoon to find a note in his file flagging me. The person who'd spent 2 years learning his medication schedule. And she got to his accountant. Walter, being Walter, had set things up carefully years before. There was a trust. The house, the investments, the retirement accounts, all of it sat in a revocable living trust, with Walter as trustee while he was able, and a successor named to take over if he couldn't. For a long time I had no idea who the successor was, and I never asked. Because it was none of my business. Delphine assumed it was her. She was the oldest. She was the responsible one. She'd been managing the family for decades. And during those 6 foggy weeks, while Walter was slurring and confused, she went to his accountant and his estate attorney and tried to have herself confirmed as successor trustee, and to have the trust updated, her word, to reflect the family's current dynamics. The current dynamics, in Delphine's telling, were these. Grant had been captured by a manipulative wife, and any inheritance to Grant should be protected by routing it through Delphine. The house should go to Delphine, since she lived closest and could manage it. And there was language. I read it later. I have a copy. I will never forget it. Proposing that I be explicitly excluded from any benefit, direct or indirect, in light of documented concerns regarding undue influence. Documented concerns. She'd written it like a legal finding. She'd built a whole paper fortress out of nothing but her own accusations, repeated enough times that they'd started to look like evidence. And the accountant, the new one, the one Delphine had been cultivating, went along with it. He drafted the amendments. He scheduled a signing. There was just one problem, and it was the problem that, in the end, unraveled everything. Walter got better. The fog lifted. By late February, his speech was back. His thinking was sharp again, and the first thing he did when he could form a clear sentence was ask why I'd stopped visiting. When I told him about the note in his file, the estranged daughter-in-law flag, he went very, very quiet. Then he asked Grant to bring him his reading glasses and his folder of important papers, the ones he kept in the fireproof box in his closet. And he started reading what had been put in front of him to sign while he was sick. I wasn't there for that part. Grant was. He told me about it that night, and his voice was shaking when he did. He said his father read every page, slowly, twice, and then set the papers down on the rehab bed and said, "She tried to do this while I couldn't read." Not angry. Worse than angry. Sad in that bottomless way. The way a parent sounds when a child confirms a thing the parent spent a lifetime hoping wasn't true. What happened over the next 3 months? I'll tell you plainly. Because Delphine spent so much energy making things complicated that the truth deserves to be simple. Walter got himself discharged and came home. He fired the new accountant and the new attorney and went back to the ones he'd used for 20 years. The originals, the ones Delphine had quietly sidelined. He revoked the temporary medical proxy and put a proper, notarized one in place, naming Grant. And then he sat down with his original estate attorney, a sharp older woman named Ms. Okafor who had drafted his trust back when Grant was in high school, and he asked her one question. Who had he actually named as successor trustee? All those years ago, before any of this. The answer was Grant. It had always been Grant. Walter had named his steadiest, most level-headed child, not the oldest, not the loudest, but the one he trusted to do the right thing without being asked. Delphine had built an 8-month campaign on top of an assumption she'd never bothered to verify. But here's the part that turned it from a family squabble into something with teeth. Miss Okafor, going through the file, found the amendment package the new accountant had drafted, the one excluding me, rerouting Grant's inheritance through Delphine, handing her the house. And she found the date on the signing appointment Delphine had scheduled, and she compared it against Walter's medical records from that exact week, the ones documenting his post-stroke cognitive impairment. In other words, Delphine had attempted to have a trust amended in her own favor during a window when the trustee was medically documented as cognitively impaired, using a proxy she'd obtained while the family was scattered, after telling a care facility to monitor and exclude the one person who could have stopped her. Ms. Okafor put down her pen and said, in the gentlest possible voice, that this was no longer just a family matter. Now, I want to be honest about something, because these stories always make it sound like the bad person gets struck by lightning and everyone cheers. It wasn't like that. It was slow and it was sad, and the sadness was the worst part. Walter did not want to destroy his daughter. Even then, even after everything, he sat at his kitchen table, the same table where I'd brought him tuna melts for 2 years, and he wept, and he said, "I keep thinking about where I went wrong with her." I held his hand and told him he didn't go wrong, that some people are just hungry in a way no amount of love fills up, and I believed it then, and I believe it now. But he also wasn't a man who let things slide. He'd spent his life making sure bridges didn't collapse, and he understood, better than anyone, what happens when you ignore a structural flaw, because acknowledging it is painful. So he did the necessary thing. He had Miss Okafor send Delphine a letter, a formal one. It laid out, point by point, what had been discovered, the proxy obtained under questionable circumstances, the attempt to amend the trust during a period of documented incapacity, the false statements made to the care facility about my relationship to him. It did not threaten her, exactly. It simply stated the facts and noted that they had been documented and preserved, and that any further attempt to interfere with Walter's affairs or to misrepresent the family situation would be addressed through appropriate legal channels. And then Walter did the thing that I think hurt Delphine the most, more than any lawsuit could have. He did exactly what he'd always planned to do, openly, in the daylight, with the whole family watching. He gathered everyone. Not for a confrontation, for a reading almost, except he was alive to do it himself. He sat them all down in his living room, the same room where Delphine had spent months whispering, and he told them, calmly, how his affairs were arranged and why. The trust would pass to Grant as successor trustee, as it always had been designed to. The estate would be divided fairly among his children, yes, including Delphine, because Walter was a better person than she'd been to me. But with one exception, the house, his and his late wife's house, would not be sold or fought over. It would go to Grant and me, with the explicit written instruction that it was in recognition of the care provided when care was needed. He read that line out loud, in recognition of the care provided when care was needed. And he looked at Delphine when he read it. I have never seen a room so quiet. The reason it landed so hard wasn't the money. It was that every accusation Delphine had spent 2 years constructing collapsed in a single sentence. She'd called me a gold digger, and here was the actual gold, going to the actual person who'd actually shown up, given by a clear-eyed man in full possession of his faculties, with his reasoning stated plainly in front of witnesses. There was nothing left to whisper. The whispering was over because the truth had a date and a signature and a notary stamp. The fallout was its own slow karma. Delphine's brokerage took a hit, not from us, we never said a word publicly, but from the simple fact that her own conduct, once it came into focus, made people in her life look at her differently. 2 of her business partners, who'd known the family for years and had heard her version of events, quietly learned the real version. One of them had a parent of his own in declining health, and watching what Delphine had attempted with hers seems to have curdled something in him. The partnership dissolved within the year. I'm told it was framed as creative differences. I know what it really was. Her relationship with her brothers never recovered. The younger one, who'd gone distant from me on her say-so, came to my house one Saturday with a 6-pack and an apology so sincere I almost couldn't accept it. He'd believed her. He felt sick about it. He'd had no idea, he said, that the whole time he was being cool to me, I was the one driving his father to physical therapy. I told him it was okay, and mostly it was, but I'd be lying if I said the months of cold shoulders from people I'd considered family hadn't left a bruise. And Delphine herself, the woman who'd spent her life as the manager, the center, the one everyone owed, found out what it's like to be the one nobody calls. She didn't get invited to the next Thanksgiving. Not because anyone banned her. Nobody had the stomach for that kind of drama. She just wasn't, in the quiet way families have of letting a person drift out of the rotation. She'd spent 2 years trying to push me out of the family. In the end, the only person who left was her. Walter lived another 4 years. Good years, mostly. The house got its gutters cleaned on schedule by me every fall, and he supervised from a lawn chair and told me I was doing it wrong, and I told him to come up and do it himself then, and he laughed every single time. When he passed, it was in his sleep, in his own bed. In the house his wife had loved, and Grant and I were the ones there. I held his hand. I'm grateful every day that I was the one there to do it. Delphine came to the funeral, sat in the back, left before the reception. I caught her eye once across the cemetery, and there was nothing in her face I could read. Not remorse, not anger, just a kind of hollowness, the look of someone who'd played a long game for the highest stakes and lost, and still couldn't quite figure out how. I didn't go to her. There was nothing to say. The receipts had said it all years before. People ask me sometimes, when I tell this story, whether I forgave her. And the honest answer is that forgiveness was never really the point. I don't carry her around with me. I don't lie awake replaying it. She doesn't get to be the main character in my life the way she tried to be the main character in Walter's death. But forgive? Forgiveness implies she ever asked, ever acknowledged, ever once said the words. She didn't. You can't forgive a door that never opened. What I did instead was keep my receipts, literally and otherwise. I learned that the truth, by itself, is not enough. That a lie told confidently enough will swallow a quiet truth whole, every time, unless the truth has something solid in its hands. I learned that the people who help least often narrate loudest, and that the only defense against a good storyteller is a better documented story. I learned that showing up, day after unglamorous day, with grab bars and tuna melts and gas receipts, is its own kind of power, slow, undramatic, easy to mock, and absolutely impossible to fake. The house is ours now. We raised our kids in it. There's a little dent in the bathroom door frame where Walter's walker used to bump it, and I've never fixed it, because every time I see it, I remember exactly why we're here. And every fall, when I clean those gutters, I still hear him telling me I'm doing it wrong. I hope I always do. The dent in that bathroom door frame taught me more than any victory ever could. For 2 years, I thought staying quiet was the same as keeping the peace. It wasn't. Delphine read my silence as an invitation, and she walked right through it, because people who manipulate don't fear the truth. They fear someone who can prove it. The day I started saving receipts, screenshotting texts, and writing down every visit, I wasn't being paranoid. I was finally refusing to let a confident lie swallow a quiet truth. That's the part nobody tells you. Being right means nothing if you can't hold it in your hands when the room goes silent. What undid Delphine wasn't bad luck. It was the slow, exact arithmetic of how she lived. She spent years narrating other people's worth while contributing none of the work, and when the moment came that required actual showing up, a father on a bathroom floor, a man relearning how to speak after a stroke, she was swamped with the spring market. You can't fake 2 years of grab bars and tuna melts and Friday afternoons. The care I gave wasn't strategy. It was just who I'd decided to be, long before I knew there was anything to win. And in the end, the thing she wanted most slipped through her fingers precisely because she was the kind of person who'd reach for it. I want you to take something practical from this, not just a feeling. Be the person who does the unglamorous work even when no one's keeping score. Because character built in private is the only kind that holds up in public. Stay clear-eyed enough to recognize a slow drip of small cruelties for what it is, a pattern, not an accident, and document what matters before you need it, not after. And when your turn comes to stand in a silent room and tell the truth, find the steadiness to do it without flinching, even when your face is hot and your hands are shaking around a casserole dish. Walter never wanted revenge. He wept at his own kitchen table over a daughter he couldn't understand. But he also understood, better than anyone, what happens when you ignore a crack in something load-bearing because looking at it hurts. So he did the necessary thing in the daylight, with witnesses, with a notary's stamp. That's the difference between justice and cruelty. One is loud and craves an audience, the other is quiet and just wants the structure to hold. I still clean those gutters every fall. I still hear him telling me I'm doing it wrong. And I've made peace with the fact that I never got an apology because forgiveness was never the point. You can't forgive a door that never opened. What I got instead was better, a home, a clear conscience, and the certainty that showing up, plainly, daily, without applause, is a power no one can ever take or fake.